What Christ shows us here is that the creative imagination has the power to combat all enemies, that we are protected by the flow of our own inspiration. Clearly what Jesus most despised, what he really railed against time and time again, were the forces that represented the established order of things, symbolized by the scribes and Pharisees, those dull, small-minded scholars of religious law who dogged his every move. Christ saw them as enemies of the imagination, who actively blocked the spiritual flight of the people and kept them bogged down with theological nitpicking, intellectualism, and law. What was Christ's great bugbear and what has sat like dung in the doorway of the Christian church ever since was the Pharisees' preoccupation with the law in preference to the Logos. Said St. Paul to the Corinthians, "The letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life." So how can one be elevated spiritually if they are loaded up with the chains of religious jurisprudence? How can the imagination be told how to behave? How can inspiration, or for that matter God, be moral? "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites," berates Christ in Matthew, "for ye shut up the kingdom of heaven against men." And further on he says, "Ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones." This was the language of the Lord, and it was lines like these that were at once compassionate and venomous that I found reverberating through my own words. Christ was forgiving, merciful, and loving, but he was, after all, the Son of the Old Testament God, and his Father's blood still boiled in his veins. In creating his Son, God the Father had evolved. He had moved on. No longer was God's mercy reserved for elect nations and their kings. No longer were the divine rewards handed down to lords temporal and spiritual. Christ, the Son, came as an individual, the Word made flesh, to set right the misguided notions of his Father, or as Paul wrote to the Corinthians, God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. Christ came to right the wrongs of his Father. Christ, the man, who abhorred the concept of a spiritual elite, spoke to every man. He came with the gift of language, of love, of imagination. Said Jesus in the Gospel of John, "The words I speak unto you, they are the spirit and they are the life." And it is these words, his language, the Logos, that speaks so eloquently and mysteriously from the Gospels. Christ is the imagination, at times terrible, irrational, incendiary, and beautiful, in short, godlike. And so, like Jesus, there is the blood of my Father in me, and it was from him that I inherited, among other things, a love of literature, of words. And just as Christ was to his Father, I am a generation further on, and if you'll forgive me, Dad, in evolutionary terms, an advanced version. What my father always wanted to do was to write a book, and in that room where he used to take me and commune with me through the language of others, him giving and I receiving, was a desk which contained the beginnings of several aborted novels, all neatly, sadly filed and titled. When I was about 12, my father asked me, weirdly, what I had done to assist humanity. I had no idea what he was talking about, but turned the question around and asked him what he had done. He said he had written a couple of short stories that had been published in magazines, and I shared in his pride as he showed them to me. But I noticed that the magazines were of an earlier decade, and it was clear that these 2 short stories were tiny seeds planted in a garden that did not grow. In 1985, I went to live in Berlin, where I got it into my head to write a novel, and for the next 3 years I locked myself away in a room in Kreuzberg and wrote it. I called it And the Ass or the Angel. It was about a mad, hermetic, mute boy called Euclid Eucrow, who, having been denied the faculty of speech, eventually explodes in a catharsis of rage and brings to its knees the religious community in which he lives. The story, set in the American South and told through the voice or non-voice of Euclid U. Crow, was written in a kind of hyper-poetic thought-speak not meant to be spoken, a mongrel language that was part biblical, part Deep South dialect, part gutter slang, at times obscenely reverent and at others reverently obscene. Throughout the story, God fills the mute boy with information, loads him up with bad ideas, hate inspirations straight from God, as he puts it. But with no one to talk to, and no way to talk, Euclid, like a blocked pipe, bursts. For me, Euclid is Jesus struck dumb. He is the blocked artist. He is internalized imagination become madness. God is not found in Christ, but through him. In the Gospel of Thomas, Christ states that the kingdom is inside of you and it is outside of you. This statement must have terrified early Christian ministry as it rendered them obsolete. Why do we need the church to bring us close to God when he already lives within us? And hence the Nicene Council's decision not to allow it into the New Testament canon. Apart from the sheer subversiveness of this statement, what is really so remarkable about it is the emphasis it places upon our individual selves. Rather than praising a personal and supernatural God as an almighty, all-knowing, all-seeing force existing somewhere in the great beyond, the emphasis is placed clearly on man, that without him as a channel, God has nowhere to go. Wherever two or more are gathered together, I am in your midst, Jesus said. Just as we are divine creations, so must we in turn create. Divinity must be given its freedom to flow through us, through language, through communication, through imagination. I believe this is our spiritual duty made clear to us through the example of Christ. Through us, God finds his voice. For just as we need God, he in turn needs us. God found life through my father as he raved and flailed about his study reciting his favourite literature, but died in the desk drawer that contained those pages, the first painful contractions of his stillborn dreams. My father asked me what I had done to assist humanity, and at 12 years old I could not answer. I now know. Like Christ, I too come in the name of my Father, to keep God alive.